It was one of the strangest things that could have happened in the early 2000s. A WWF contracted wrestler faced a WCW contracted wrestler in an ECW ring. Just past 25 years ago, Mike Awesome returned to ECW for one night to drop the title he still held when he made his WCW debut. It's a quite confusing story to get your head around when you question it. Like, how and why did Paul Heyman allow his world champion to even be able to jump ship in the first place? I mean, money. The answer's likely money, but why specifically? In this video, we'll go through the timeline from Mike Awesome's last match as an ECW regular to his arrival in WCW and what happened to get him back to drop the belt. Mike Awesome's second reign as ECW World Champion began on the December 31st, 1999 edition of ECW on TNN, where he defeated Masato Tanaka, who himself had won it from Awesome on the previous week's episode. From here, he would enter into a brutal feud with, of all people, Spike Dudley, including one of the craziest pay-per-view world title matches ever at Guilty as Charged 2000. From here, Awesome continued to defend the title against all challengers. He again beat Tanaka, as well as new challengers such as Kid Cash, Spanish Angel, and future world champion Rhino. You might be wondering where some of the bigger ECW names are on that list. Don't worry, we'll get to that in a little while. On April 2nd, 2000, though taped on March 24th, Awesome would defend his title for the final time on Hardcore TV against Kid Cash. On the TNN episode that aired the night before, Awesome would cut an impassioned promo about how nobody was going to take the ECW world title from him, saying, "The way I see it, I bled across 4 continents for this belt, and nobody's gonna take it from me, because it's the only belt that matters today." On April 7th, Mike Awesome would make his penultimate appearance on ECW on TNN, where he would come out to interject himself in the never-ending Tommy Dreamer vs. Raven saga. Awesome vows that Raven didn't put a hit out on Dreamer, revealing that it was actually his manager, Judge Jeff Jones. Awesome proceeds to beat down both Raven and Dreamer, putting both men through tables with Awesome bombs. After an ad break and a backstage promo, Jones explains that he put a bounty out for Dreamer because he was inspired by watching old wrestling tapes. Not the best of reasons, but he did it in his own words, for his own amusement. Mike Awesome threatens Jones to give him the cash reward, and another for attacking Raven. In what would become a truly ironic visual, the last time Mike Awesome would be seen as an ECW roster member is with the heavyweight title belt in one hand and a wad of cash in the other. On the following night's Hardcore TV, they would air a replay of the attack on Raven and Dreamer, and afterwards, Joey Styles would make clear that the storyline was heading towards Dreamer being the next challenger to Mike Awesome. He didn't say this part, but likely at the upcoming pay-per-view Hardcore Heaven on May 14th. This would never happen though, as the next time Mike would be seen on television was his WCW debut on April 10th. But how much of a surprise was this really? In the 2 weeks between Awesome's last bookings and his Nitro debut, in the Wrestling Observer newsletter there's no mention at all of the possibility of him leaving. Nor is there throughout any of March. In fact, future plans for Awesome are laid out in some detail. On the March 10th, 2000 episode of ECW on TNN, Awesome and Raven would win the Tag Team Championships from Masato Tanaka and Tommy Dreamer, though they would lose them a couple of days later to the Impact players at Living Dangerously. Dave would theorize in the March 20th issue that Awesome won the titles as part of the ongoing build to an eventual dream match between Mike Awesome and then television champion Rob Van Dam. Van Dam, who was at the time unmistakably one of ECW's most popular wrestlers, despite being the mid-card champion for at that point nearly 2 years, was eventually set to take over as the promotion's main event star. But this would be halted when he would suffer a leg injury that would force him out of the ring for months, having to let go of the TV title without anyone beating him for it. In the week before's issue, Dave mentioned more directly that the goal was to get to Van Dam vs. Awesome, even suggesting that Cyrus should manage the world champion, given that Awesome could have done with someone doing the talking for him. In the March 27th issue, Dave Meltzer noted that Japanese promotion FMW, where Awesome achieved success before ECW as the Gladiator, was set to run a tour through late April and early May, in which Awesome was scheduled to appear as the ECW World Champion. This tells us that seemingly Awesome wasn't leaving at that point, and it's pretty safe to assume that it wasn't seen coming. On April 10th, the unthinkable would happen, as Mike Awesome would make his Nitro debut. This episode is infamous for several reasons, mainly that it's the major reset episode, where Eric Bischoff and Vince Russo were introduced as the on-screen authority figures. In the show's opening segment, all championships were vacated, including Sid Vicious reluctantly handing over the world title, with new champions set to be crowned at the next pay-per-view, Spring Stampede. This episode also served as the beginning of the dreaded Millionaires Club vs New Blood storyline, which would punish viewers throughout the spring and summer. In the weeks leading up to the show, it had been well known that the reset button was to be pushed, with Dave Meltzer's review of the March 27th Nitro saying, "Every angle that was done on TV this week was meaningless, because everything starts anew in 2 weeks. There isn't one match certain for Spring Stampede, nor will there be until 410. The only major angle they're pushing is to build toward Bischoff vs Russo, but nobody knows where the chips fall from there." While this has the obvious downside of your television up to April 10th feeling pointless, the other side of the coin is that fans can expect the 410 episode to be a big eventful one. So what better time to pull off a major shock, like say the world champion of a rival company making their surprise debut. On Nitro that night, Kevin Nash entered the ring for a promo, walking with crutches and wearing a medical boot. He was there to tell Eric Bischoff and Vince Russo that Scott Hall would be coming back soon, saying that he's sober and he's in a bad mood. When Nash is done, Mike Awesome climbs into the ring and attacks Nash from behind, dropping him with a clothesline before breaking one of the crutches by hitting him repeatedly. Awesome then got on the microphone and pledged his allegiance to Bischoff and Russo. Unsurprisingly, the Nitro reset was the major story of the following week's Observer. Perhaps more interestingly though, the details of Mike Awesome leaving ECW led the issue. Dave opens by likening the moment to Lex Luger appearing on episode 1 of Nitro, mixed with Medusa throwing the WWF Women's title belt in a bin. Since they were unable to secure any WWF talent, they made a huge pitch to garner ECW's heavyweight champion. According to Mike Awesome himself, in comments I'll get to later, this isn't quite how it happened, as it was Awesome who actually first reached out, but not to them directly. Dave stated that according to ECW, Awesome had 2 more years on his deal, but he had no-showed the week's events in Cleveland and Warren, Ohio on April 6 and 7. When Awesome missed the first show, there was no cause for concern, since he stated his flight from Florida was grounded and he had never missed a show previously. He then claimed on the second night that his flight was delayed and that he would be there just before bell time, but he never showed up. By that evening, word was getting around about a report on the Bubba the Love Sponge radio show that morning in Tampa. A known wrestling fan who has worked with all 3 major promotions when they run the city and is well known for being friends with Terry Bollea and Jimmy Hart, claiming that WCW had made Awesome a high 6-figure per year offer and he was joining the company. This might be a little closer to the mark, as Hogan will come up again later on. It seems then that by Saturday, April 8th, everyone seemed to know, or at least suspect, that Awesome would be appearing on Nitro, and wasn't planning on returning to ECW to drop their championship. Paul Heyman apparently showed up to that evening's TNN tapings with a contract that he claimed was Mike's, for $600,000 per year. There were signatures on it that Heyman claimed were Awesome's. It being Paul Heyman though, some were still suspicious, particularly since friends of Alfonso, Mike Awesome's real name, and apparently even Alfonso himself, were insistent that he had never actually signed his contract. In a kayfabe commentary's release about ECW in 2000, Just Incredible offered his thoughts on how Awesome was able to jump to WCW. He said, "The contracts Paul had on us were so flimsy. I remember Paul having some of the contracts written on napkins. In a court of law, some of that stuff is laughable." Justin goes on to say that the top guys in ECW around that time will have had $100,000 to $150,000 downsides, meaning that they would make no less than that amount per year, regardless of how many dates they worked, which pales in comparison to the offer WCW gave Awesome, which is rumoured to be around 3 times that. On the day of April 10th, ECW did whatever it could to attempt to prevent Awesome from appearing, including trying to get a restraining order to bar him from being on the show, with no luck. By the time he did eventually show up on Nitro, a deal had been put in place, with negotiations taking place right up to the show going on the air. The final agreement was that WCW would pay ECW a figure reported in the low six figures to give Alfonso a release from his deal, and in return, Alfonso would not bring the ECW belt on television, would appear in street clothes to do his angle with Kevin Nash, and WCW would allow him to wrestle in Indianapolis for ECW on 4/13 to drop the title in the ring. The match had to take place on Thursday, April 13th, so that ECW could insert it into their TNN episode the day after, and Hardcore TV that weekend. Also as part of the deal, WCW agreed to plug that Awesome was the ECW World Champion, but they were also supposed to say that his latest title defense would occur that Friday on TNN, which they didn't do. Awesome also wasn't supposed to do an interview, which Heyman saw as a broken deal when Awesome cut a short promo on the microphone. WCW failing to plug the upcoming title match and allowing Awesome to talk led to more negotiating throughout the following day ahead of the Thunder tapings, and Eric Bischoff would appear on Wrestling Observer Live to discuss the situation.
How did everything go down yesterday with Mike Awesome and over like whatever it was the last week, or what did it take to bring him in, and how did everything get settled with ECW?
Actually, it's not settled, and because it's not settled, I can't talk about it. And it's not that I don't want to, but I literally, the reason I was 10 minutes late calling into you is I was on the phone with our attorneys, and I can't discuss.
Okay. So is he is he with you, or is everything still up in the air then?
It's still a jump ball.
Oh, wow. Okay.
While it might sound like Eric is giving a non-answer, the fact that he couldn't yet talk about it does go to show just how unresolved it still was the day after Awesome's debut. In the following week's Observer, Dave would outline what had been happening behind the scenes. He specifies that as part of the arrangement made on the Monday, the announcers were given what they were supposed to say about Awesome being the champion and having a defense on Friday, but for whatever reason they just didn't read it on the air. The wording of what Paul Heyman demanded and what was scripted for the WCW announcers to say has been confirmed as being identical. From watching the tape, it appeared Scott Hudson was reading the wording and was cut off by Tony Schiavone. For what it's worth, Schiavone has claimed differently on his What Happened When podcast. He said, speaking in April 2019, "I remember him rolling in the ring, and Terry Taylor saying in my ear, 'That's Mike Awesome. He's the ECW Heavyweight Champion. Say that.' I didn't know Mike Awesome was rolling into the ring. I didn't know what to say when he rolled in the ring, but I was told to say that." Tony has many times claimed on his podcast that he never watched nor was he familiar with ECW, so it's entirely possible that he just didn't know who Mike Awesome was. He's also said a fair bit that he, quote, didn't give a shit by this point of his time in WCW, so that might have played a factor too. Regardless, the company's failure to live up to this part of the deal resulted in Awesome being pulled from Thunder that week, but a clip of what had happened on Nitro would air as a recap. You might be wondering what Mike Awesome's view of all this is. Speaking in a 2003 interview with Title Match, Mike maintained his claim that he didn't have a contract at the time. Basically, I was driving to the show, and I was thinking to myself, you know what? We didn't get paid last week. We're not getting paid this week. What's going on? He says that paydays would sporadically be missed, and was regretting leaving Japan. He goes on to call his decision to leave FMW a bad career move. Mike then says he was talking about this to a former FMW co-worker, Horace Hogan, who passed Awesome's dilemma on to Uncle Terry. Awesome says that Hogan convinced him to no-show his final ECW dates, and that he was put in touch with Bischoff and Russo from there. When asked about being ECW champion, he says he couldn't have cared less about the belt. It's cool to be the champion. It's not everything. Being able to provide for your family is number one, actually. He stresses in detail that even while he was ECW champion, he was struggling to support his wife and 2 children. According to another interview that Mike did with Wrestling Epicenter in January 2004, he talked with WCW for about 4 days before deciding to jump ship, again citing his financial situation as his reason. The only hard feelings I had were not getting paid with ECW the way I was supposed to be. I didn't really have any hard feelings with any of the guys there. Regarding the contract that Heyman claims that he had signed, the one that Dave wrote about in The Observer, Mike tells a different story that I feel you should hear him explain himself. Once again, all credit goes for this clip to Wrestling Epicenter.
Paul got an injunction against me to keep me from wrestling with WCW because he said I had a signed contract, which I did not have a signed contract with him. And he did produce a contract that had a signature about 3 inches below where you're supposed to sign it at. Not a signature, initials, my initials, right, which clearly were not my initials. So we were going to go to court and fight it, and WCW agreed to settle out of court, paid Paul like $50,000, and that's the way it got settled.
One final interesting thing to note from this part of the interview is in response to the question of why Awesome received different treatment to Taz and the Dudleys, who had left the year prior.
Why do you think that your move was...
Oh, because I just walked out and didn't say a word to him. Didn't show up at the show. I was the heavyweight champion. I didn't do it professionally. I didn't do it the way I should have. I guess I was a little upset about not getting paid and just jumped the way I did.
At this time, there were no plans for who Awesome would drop the belt to, but Taz would be interviewed by Alex Marvez for WrestlingObserver.com and would have this to say. I think it's great for Mike Awesome and his family financially if it's there, but I feel that him as the world champion from ECW going to Nitro is horrible. I'm old school. I'm a firm believer in doing business the right way when you're going out the door. He goes on to say that he has no bad feelings towards Awesome, which is lucky because he would be meeting him in the ring pretty soon. On April 13th in Indianapolis, Indiana, ECW ran a house show at which Awesome would return for one night to drop the championship. The minute and a bit long match would air as part of the following day's episode of ECW on TNN. At the start of the show, a late breaking news graphic appears showing Taz with 2 Z's on screen. A voiceover from Paul Heyman promises that on the previous night, Taz had shocked the wrestling world, and we would see what happened by the end of the program. Later on in the hour, the show, which was otherwise taped in Buffalo, New York, is interrupted by footage from Indiana, as we cut to Mike Awesome standing in the ring as Taz's WWE music plays. If you're curious as I was, I went back and found a non-WWE Network version of the show, and they did in fact play his WWE theme, not his ECW one. And they were also careful to call him the Human Wrecking Machine, not Suplex Machine as he had been. We're lucky they didn't call him the Suplex King, as Vince McMahon did in the Rise and Fall of ECW doc. In the title match interview I referenced earlier, Mike Awesome says that Paul Heyman wouldn't allow him into the locker room that night. He claims that before the day of the show, he was faxed with information from Paul Heyman's attorney of how the match would go and his participation would be laid out. They wanted me to be waiting outside until it was time for me to enter the ring and come in through the front door. They didn't want me in the dressing room. They didn't want any problems. Everything was being conducted by the lawyers at that point. Both sides just wanted to make sure that everything was gonna go right and go smooth. Another interesting thing that Awesome says is that he would prefer to have wrestled the match with a different opponent. I wish he'd stuck me out there with Rhino, cause I would have gave them a stellar performance. I would have given them the match of a lifetime if it could have been with someone like Rhino, someone I trust, who I know wouldn't try to hurt me on purpose out there. I couldn't trust Taz. Rhino's time would come later, and at that point you could definitely see star potential on him, especially in ECW with smaller opponents, but the match wouldn't have drawn anywhere near as much attention as a WWE star being sent in. As far as the match being as short as it was, this is purely my speculation, but I wonder if it was designed to be so short, so it could easily be added into the following night's TV episode, which might have been otherwise edited by then. Taz gets in the ring, and the two very quickly start brawling to the outside. Given that the event wasn't originally supposed to be taped, ECW only had one good camera and one crap one, which is why you might be noticing some varying image quality here. Very quickly, they get back in the ring, and Tommy Dreamer runs in and delivers a DDT to Awesome. Taz then applies the Taz mission, and Mike Awesome gives up. As soon as the match ends, Awesome bails out of the ring, over the guardrail and leaves, while Tommy Dreamer raises Taz's hand in the ring. In the Observer, Dave notes that Paul Heyman pitched directly to Vince McMahon the idea of Taz coming in and taking the belt back, and he apparently also pitched him dropping it on April 22nd at his next big event, CyberSlam. He seemingly hadn't been watching much WWE lately though. Taz had not gotten a clean win on Raw or SmackDown in nearly 2 months, a win on February 17th against Gangrel. I suppose that didn't matter to Paul though. He got his belt back and made a lot of headlines in the process. Dave would write, The upside is that ECW and the ECW belt, as well as Dreamer, got exposure on WWF television. How true this is though, that's a matter of your perspective. Now I know we've strayed away a bit from Mike Awesome, and we'll get back to him in a few minutes, but I can't cover this subject without talking about how Taz represented ECW on WWE television. And yes, I'm sorry, but we're gonna have to get to that match. On April 17th, 2000, Taz would enter Monday Night Raw as the ECW World Champion, even wearing the belt to the ring. Remember that quote I just read to you about ECW benefiting? We're putting that to the test here, as the ECW Champion would lose to Crash Holly in a hardcore title match that also included Perry Saturn. While Taz isn't the one to lose the fall, it doesn't help that Jim Ross, tasked with explaining things, tells us that Taz won the title, quote, on his day off. I can see what he was getting at, but it still feels like a belittling choice of words, as opposed to maybe saying Taz was able to compete for ECW's World Championship, and he overcame the odds while keeping his WWE schedule. Still, if this was a test of the value of having the ECW belt on Raw, the following night would be one more so, but we'll get to that in a second. If you're wondering, Mike Awesome wouldn't have a much more impressive night on Nitro, as he would win a 2-minute match against Diamond Dallas Page by DQ when Kanyon attacked him. The disqualification comes right after several chair shots and a lengthy speech from Tony Schiavone and Mark Madden about how the rules are now relaxed in the new WCW, and DQs won't be happening. WCW 2000. The segment ends with Mike Awesome, the latest acquisition from another company, being powerbombed through a table by Kevin Nash. The exact same thing he did to everyone in ECW. On April 18th, 2000, but not airing till the 20th, Taz would find himself in another champion versus champion match, but not for the hardcore title this time. Taz would face the WWE champion Triple H, and I feel like even if you didn't know what happened, you can make a fair guess based on me saying that alone. To make things worse, the match takes place in Philadelphia of all places, at the building formerly known as the First Union Center, less than 3 miles away from the ECW arena. Welcome to yet another Geography channel. Initially, the match is fairly inoffensive, with the opening few minutes being the two evenly trading strikes, with Taz eventually getting the upper hand when the match spills outside the ring, as you would expect to happen. Taz applies the Taz mission, leading Stephanie McMahon to distract the referee, while Triple H escapes Taz's finishing hold with a low blow and a pedigree. To set up Taz's title challenger later in the week, Tommy Dreamer runs in and attempts to hit Triple H with a chair. He misses, clocks Taz instead, and eats a pedigree too. The end of the match was clearly designed to accomplish some goals. It was put together so that Taz got some offense in, but not too much offense. He didn't lose cleanly and had his next challenger lined up. But at the same time, the match hurt the ECW title with how messy it all looked, like Triple H was in there with people from a lesser league than his own. On Taz losing to Triple H and the WWE's involvement in general, Dave Meltzer would have this to say. While it would be premature to say ECW was a loser in this deal with WWF, it certainly hasn't proven to be a winner. WWF appears to be a winner, in a game where WWF being a winner doesn't make ECW necessarily a loser. Just Incredible, talking to Sean Oliver in the interview I quoted earlier, said, "Anytime you do anything with Vince, the ECW thing is going to get buried. At best, you could argue that ECW ended up alright in the end, and about to move on with a new champion. A champion Paul Heyman had wanted for a fair while." A few days later, on April 22nd, Taz would appear at CyberSlam to drop the ECW World title. Paul Heyman's chosen opponent for him was Tommy Dreamer, a mainstay of ECW by that point, and very likely someone Paul knew he wasn't going to lose to a bigger promotion. While the Taz vs Dreamer match didn't air on TV, we joined Tommy after the match for what would become the next story development. Taz hands the championship to Tommy as a sign of respect, much like he did to Mike Awesome when he left the first time, and takes his leave. After that, the locker room empties to congratulate Tommy. Even his biggest enemy, Raven, comes out to congratulate him. The celebration doesn't last long though, as Just Incredible then comes out and attacks Tommy and Raven, just as Mike Awesome had. Justin challenges Tommy, who accepts, and we have Dreamer's first and only title defense. Just when it looks like Tommy might win, Francine turns on him with a low blow, and Just Incredible becomes the new ECW World Champion, to at least get something out of this whole mess that Paul could take further, a new main event heel. Dave Meltzer would note that Just Incredible had been the planned champion for a long time, once ECW reached a bigger televised platform like TNN. But injuries and people leaving the company had derailed this for a long time, as far back as early '99. The original plan was for Shane Douglas to hold it until getting a national outlet, going to Credible for a long run, finally building for Van Dam's big chase. But that was changed several times along the way. Dave would even opine that Credible might make for some interesting new main events. Unlike Awesome, and even to an extent his predecessor Taz, Credible doesn't have to be protected by Heyman from doing singles matches with people like Sandman or Raven, that there would be a major style conflict with. Now I wanted to end this video by posing a question to you, one that I don't think there's an answer for, or certainly not a straightforward one. Did Mike Awesome leaving ECW the way he did hurt his career any in the long run? It's hard to really hate on someone for moving on to a bigger opportunity, especially to support themselves financially. But what makes the situation different to all the others who left ECW was how Mike Awesome was booked to steamroll over everyone on his way out. Awesome had gone through the ECW locker room, and Heyman had kept him strong, with the idea that he and Rob Van Dam would be the ultimate big money program. And he never returned the favour by putting over someone from the company he'd eaten up. In both of the interviews I've quoted in this video, Mike is well aware that his run in WCW began to nosedive when he was booked as the 70s guy and as the Fat Chick Thriller, and he blames this on Bash at the Beach 2000. This was Hulk Hogan's last night in WCW, someone who Awesome implies was his strongest ally. In the Wrestling Epicenter interview I quoted earlier, Mike is at one point asked his opinion of Paul Heyman nearly 4 years after what happened. He calls Paul a snake, and implies that Heyman might be responsible for his poor faring in WWE. This is possible, given that he was assigned to the SmackDown brand, where Paul served as head writer in the early days of the draft. During the Monday Night Wars, many people jumped from company to company, sometimes more than once. Many of these jumps are pretty forgettable, but Mike Awesome's surprise debut in WCW is certainly not that. Is that for the better or worse though? Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.